श्री अद्वैत गदाधर श्रीवासादि गौर भक्त वृंद की जय। ग्रंथराज श्रीमद् भागवतम की जय। श्री श्री राधा गोपीनाथ की जय। श्री श्री गौरनिताय की जय। जगत गुरु श्री प्रभुपाद की जय। निताय गौर प्रेमानंदे हरि हरि बोल। ओम नमो भगवते वासुदेवाय। ओम नमो भगवते वासुदेवाय। ओम नमो भगवते वासुदेवाय। Reading from Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 1, Chapter 3, Krishna is the source of all incarnations, text number 33. Yatra ime sat asat rupe yatreme sadasat rupe yatreme sadasat rupe प्रतिषिद्धे स्व संविदा प्रतिषिद्धे स्वसंविदा प्रतिषिद्धे स्वसंविदा अविद्यया आत्मनि कृते अविद्ययात्मनि कृते अविद्ययात्मनि कृते इति तत् ब्रह्म दर्शनम् इति तत् ब्रह्म दर्शनम् इति तत् ब्रह्म दर्शनम् यत्रेमे सदसद्रूपे प्रतिषिद्धे स्वसंविदा अविद्ययात्मनि कृते इति तत् ब्रह्म दर्शनम् यत्रेमे सदसद्रूपे प्रतिषिद्धे स्वसंविदा अविद्ययात्मनि कृते इति तद्ब्रह्म दर्शनम् Yatra, whenever, ime, in all these, sat asat, gross and subtle, rupe, in the forms of, pratishiddhe, on being nullified, swasamveda, by self-realization, avidyaya, by ignorance, atmani, in the self, krite, having been imposed, iti, thus, tat, that is, Brahma Darshanam, the process of seeing the Absolute. Translation and purport by His Divine Grace Srila Prabhupada. Whenever a person experiences by self-realization that both the gross and subtle bodies have nothing to do with the pure self, at that time he sees himself as well as the Lord. Can you repeat? Whenever a person experiences by self-realization that both the gross and subtle bodies have nothing to do with the pure self, at that time he sees himself as well as the Lord. Purport by Srila Prabhupada. The difference between self-realization and material illusion is to know that the temporary or illusory impositions of material energy in the shape of gross and subtle bodies are superficial coverings of the self. The coverings take place due to ignorance. Such coverings are never effective in the person of the personality of Godhead. Knowing this convincingly is called liberation or seeing the Absolute. This means that perfect self-realization is made possible by adoption of godly or spiritual life. Self-realization means becoming indifferent to the needs of the gross and subtle bodies and becoming serious about the activities of the self. The impetus for activities is generated from the self, but such activities become illusory due to ignorance of the real position of the self. By ignorance, self-interest is calculated in terms of the gross and subtle bodies, and therefore a whole set of activities is spoiled life after life. When, however, one meets the self by proper culture, the activities of the self begin. Therefore, a man who is engaged in the activities of the self is called a Jivan Mukta, or a liberated person, even in the condition of existence. This perfect stage of self-realization is attained not by artificial means, but under the lotus feet of the Lord, who is always transcendental. In the Bhagavad Gita, the Lord says that He is present in everyone's heart, and from Him only all knowledge, remembrance or forgetfulness take place. When the living being desires to be an enjoyer of material energy, illusory phenomena, the Lord covers the living being in the mystery of forgetfulness, and thus the living being misinterprets the gross body and the subtle mind to be his own self. And by culture of transcendental knowledge, when the living being prays to the Lord for deliverance from the clutches of forgetfulness, the Lord by His causeless mercy removes the living being's illusory curtain, and thus he realizes his own self. He then engages himself in the service of the Lord in his eternal constitutional position, becoming liberated from the conditional life. All this is executed by the Lord, either through His external potency or directly by the internal potency. Thus is the Bhaktivedanta. Om Ajnanatikrantasya Jnananjanashalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Nama Om Vishnupadaya Krishna Preshthaya Bhutale Srimate Bhaktivedanta Swamin Nitinamine. Namaste Saraswate Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschatya Deshatarine Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shri Vasadi Gauravakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare Mukam Karoti Vachalam Pangum Langhayate Girim Yat Kripatamaham Mande Shri Gurum Deenataranam. So it is after describing the different incarnations of the Lord, here it is being said that in order to be able to see the Supreme Lord, Krishna, as He is, as well as to see oneself, it is possible only when, by self-realization, one understands that the gross and subtle bodies have nothing to do with oneself. So, in the bodily concept of life, where we identify ourselves with the gross and subtle bodies, what happens is that misidentification with the body creates the veil of ignorance which clouds the living entity's perception of himself as well as of the Supreme Lord. So, the body, as we understand from the Bhagavad Gita and from the Bhagavatam, comprises two parts: the gross body which we are able to see, which broadly constitutes or broadly is made up of the five working senses and the five knowledge acquiring senses. And the body, the gross body, which comprises the knowledge acquiring senses and the working senses, is directed and impelled into action by the subtle body residing within the gross body. The subtle body comprises the mind, intelligence and false ego. So the subtle body drives the gross body to perform various actions. Just like there is a, let us say there is a big industrial factory where many automated machines are working. The machines have various sensors and they have various components to carry out different actions. There will be robotic arms for extending, for picking up objects, placing them, screwing them in place, all such kinds of stuff. Now to run this whole automated factory, there is a software. That software is what runs the whole, all the machinery and makes them get into that production mode and to be able to produce different kinds of products. If the software doesn't run, the machinery may be there but it will not work. So similarly, in the body also, this body comprising the senses are meant for action. Either engaging in some activity through the karmendriyas or acquiring knowledge through the jnanendriyas. Now the action of these senses is directed and controlled by the subtle body. When the living entity occupies this body, then the living entity activates the subtle body and that in turn generates activity from the gross body. So the subtle body is engaged in thinking and feeling. This is the thinking and feeling of the subtle body is impelled by the soul, by the soul's desires. The soul's desires impel the subtle body to think and feel in a particular way. And then that thinking and feeling is converted into willing, means practical action, which is carried out by the senses. So now for the living entity, although it is an occupier, temporary occupier of this body, being a temporary occupier of the body, the living entity is given the freedom to run the machine of the body in whatever way it desires. But the living entity falsely identifying itself with the body and thinking that I am this gross body, I am this subtle body, what happens is the living entity falls into ignorance and fails to recognize his true self as being independent of the subtle and the gross bodies. So being fully absorbed in the subtle and gross bodies, we identify ourselves with the various needs of the gross and subtle bodies as our needs. The gross body requires, the gross body is designed in such a way to generate certain impulses. The impulse of the mind to think, the impulse of the tongue to speak something or to taste something, the impulse of anger when one's desires are frustrated. Manasa vegam, krodha vegam, jihva vegam, udarupastha vegam. Srila Rupa Goswami says in the Upadeshamrita that there are many vegams, many impulses which are generated by the gross and subtle bodies. Both of them create certain impulses which are responsible for making the soul engage in activities in this world. So when the living entity identifies himself with the body, then he starts thinking that these needs of the body are my needs. I have to fulfill them. If I don't fulfill them, I will become dissatisfied, I will be unhappy, I will be incomplete. And so, what does the living entity do? He runs after satisfying the desires which are generated from the gross and subtle bodies. So, the body requires some amount of food, some amount of sleep, some amount of mating. All these things we start thinking that without this I cannot live. These are the primary goals of my life. And then the mind has its own needs. The need for being recognized, the need for being respected, the need for being loved or wanted by others. So, puja, pratishtha, labha, the respect from other people, the adoration by other people, fame, glory, all these kind of things are what feed the subtle body. And we think whenever there is any disruption in the fulfillment of the requirements of the gross or subtle body, it is actually a disruption of my desires. It is a disruption of my needs. And so whenever our needs, which are generated by not by me, but by the subtle and gross bodies, is not fulfilled, what happens? We become frustrated. And that frustration leads to anger. And as Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, once a person allows himself under the control of anger, what happens? The person loses his memory and his intelligence, and he acts in various ways which bring about his downfall. Downfall in terms of becoming more and more under illusion and moving away from the path of understanding who I am and what is the goal of life. So, in the Upanishads, it is stated that Dvasoparna Sayuja Sakhaya Samanam Vriksham Parishashva Jate. There is a tree on which there are two birds which are sitting. Dvasuparna, Suparna means bird. Dvasuparna, two birds are sitting on the tree and both of them are friends. And what is happening? That Tayoranyah Pippalam Swadvatti, one of the birds is very much engaged, intensely engaged in tasting the fruits of that tree. And the fruits of the tree are sometimes sweet and sometimes they are bitter. And while one bird is intensely engaged in tasting the different fruits of this tree, what is the other bird doing? The other bird, Anyaha Anasnan, the other bird is not interested in eating the fruits of the tree. Abhijagashiti, he is simply witnessing what my other friend is sitting and eating all these fruits and what is he experiencing. He is simply witnessing what is going on. So this words from the Upanishads is actually simile to compare what actually goes on within our body. The tree is actually referring to the human body. And in the body, there are two living entities. It's not that there is only one living entity. There are two living entities. One is the spirit soul, the Atma, and the second is the super soul, the Paramatma. The spirit soul, the Atma, is engaged in tasting the results of his activities, which are sometimes sweet, means some happiness comes his way on account of the past punya karma or past activities that he has done. And sometimes what happens? The fruit is bitter, meaning he tastes distress due to the reactions of his past papa karma, past sinful activities. And the Paramatma is not interested in tasting the fruits of karma. He is only witnessing what this living entity is doing, and when will this Atma turn towards me? That is what the other bird or the Paramatma is interested in. Now, Samane Vrikshe Purusho Nimagno. As long as the living entity, the Atma, is engrossed in tasting the fruits of the tree, meaning the fruits of one's karma, fruits of one's activities, as long as we are interested in tasting the fruits of our actions, what happens? The living entity has to undergo different kinds of distresses. So, although the results of one's activities may result in happiness whenever one does punya karma, still
To gain that happiness of punya karma also, the living entity has to undergo great distress. The amount of happiness that we can gain by engaging in punya karma, the amount of effort that we have to put in to be able to enjoy that happiness arising out of a punya karma is far greater than the amount of happiness one will enjoy. So the proportion, the amount of effort which is put into the punya karma to be able to enjoy, compared to the amount of happiness which we actually get out of it, actually it is not proportional. It is not equal. The amount of distress we have to take is always far greater than the amount of happiness we can enjoy in this world. So therefore, samane vrikshe purusho nimagno anisaya sochati muhyamanaha. Anisaya, having forgotten the Supreme Lord, the Supreme Controller, who is seated right next to us in our heart as Paramatma, having forgotten him, Anisaya Shochati, he, because of forgetfulness of that Supreme Lord, of the Paramatma, what happens is, Shochati Muhyamanaha. The living entity has to constantly suffer distress within this material world. And Muhyamanaha, and like this, he becomes under the control of illusion, thinking that all these distresses and these happiness are actually affecting me. When there is the result of some papa karma that comes, I feel, oh, I am under great distress. And when some punya karma brings some good result, we feel, oh, I am feeling so happy. Actually, reality is that all the happiness and distress which we experience in this material world are simply experienced by the gross body and by the subtle body. But we have identified ourselves with the gross and subtle bodies so deeply that we feel whatever happiness and distress is undergone by the gross and subtle bodies, that actually I am undergoing that. The reality is the soul or the Atma is completely separated from matter. And this body, which is the gross and subtle bodies, which are made up of matter, have no connection with the soul. But under illusion, we start identifying ourselves. Just like, suppose we go to some movie and we start watching the movie. The movie is a very, very emotional drama. And when we watch the movie, especially sometimes you can see in theatres and all, there may be some ladies who are very emotionally, very, they are very moved very easily. And so they watch the movie and they start crying. So why are they crying? Some tragic or emotional scene in the movie triggers their emotions and they cannot control themselves and their emotions start outpouring and they start crying. So actually what is it? It's a movie. It's simply some visual, some color visuals which are going on the movie screen, and there is some audio to back it up. So is it reality? It's not reality. All the characters are fiction. Whatever is shown also has no reality, it has no connection with reality. But while watching the movie, if the person identifies himself with those characters being shown on the movie screen, what happens is one starts feeling emotionally for those characters. And that character in the movie is undergoing some great distress. You start feeling that distress and you start crying. So actually what is the fact? That person doesn't exist. Whatever is shown on the movie screen, those emotions are all fake, they are not real. That person is acting as if he is undergoing those emotions. So even that person who is displayed on the screen is also not actually undergoing that emotion. But when we get absorbed in the movie so much that we start identifying ourselves, we start feeling those emotions ourselves. So in a similar way, in reality also what happens is, the body, the gross and subtle bodies are undergoing some experience. But because we have identified ourselves so deeply with the gross and subtle bodies, whatever reaction undergoes in the gross and subtle bodies, we think it is happening to me. And so like this, muhyamanaha, we come under the control of illusion. So now how to get out of this illusion? How to come out of this illusion of identifying myself with the gross and subtle bodies, and how to become liberated from this entanglement within this body and experience my true emotions, my true desires. So these emotions which are coming from the gross and subtle bodies are all fake. So when we say fake emotion, there is real emotion also. Just like in the movie when we see some actors faking some emotions, that is faking of real emotions which exist in the real world. So that is how we identify with those emotions. So whatever emotions we experience within this body also, actually they are fake. They are stemming from the subtle and gross bodies. So they are fake means there must be original also, there must be original emotions of happiness, sadness, love, etc. So those emotions, those original emotions and desires, how to be able to revive them and experience those real emotions. So in the movie what happens is 1.5 hours you watch the movie, after the movie ends, you walk out of the movie theatre, then you are back in the real world and you are back to experiencing real emotions, isn't it? But whereas when we are within this body, whole life, our whole lifespan, we cannot separate ourselves from the body. You have to be within the body only. If there was some way by which, like you walk out of the movie theatre, after 10 years being in this body, you walk out of this body and enter into another body. Consciously, if there was some option for that, then we would never identify ourselves with the emotions of the body. But unfortunately what happens is, whenever we have to walk out of this body, it's called death, and we have to enter another body, and at that time all our earlier memories are erased. We forget. So suppose you are going into one theatre, watching one movie, and once the movie finishes, you have finished all your crying, you walk out of the movie and walk into the next theatre. And the moment you walk into the next theatre, your memory of the previous theatre is erased. What will happen? You sit in the new theatre, you will start identifying with the new movie. So exactly similar thing is happening with our lives. This whole, whatever we are experiencing within our life, what we see, what we feel, they are all actually one big movie going on. Only thing is, it is a 4D or 7D movie. You have smell, you have taste, you have so many things which are built into it. Unlike a movie in a theatre which can maximum be 3D, now of course they add some movement to the seats and all those kind of stuff to make you an immersive experience. But the number of D's in our body is so large that it is totally immersive. We start thinking, yes, this is my feelings and these are my desires. And so like this, we are so intricately intertwined with the material body, gross and subtle bodies, that we forget who we actually are. And when death comes, we go into another body, all memories are erased, and we take on a new body, again we identify, again the illusion continues. So then, how to get out of this illusion? Because the way the description, when we look at this, it appears it's impossible to get out of this. But the Upanishad states that Jushtam yada pashyati anyamisham. So when one understands asya mahimanamiti, when he understands that I am not the controller, there is somebody who is superior to me and who is the actual controller of this whole universe, whole creation, and that person is the Supreme Lord. And whatever I am seeing, all this going on in this material world, they are all his glorious pastimes. Asya mahimanamiti vita shokaha. Then he becomes vita shoka. He becomes free from all lamentation and illusion and distress. So the only way to become free from the clutches of the gross and subtle bodies which we have fallen into is to render devotional service to Krishna. When we render devotional service to Krishna, what happens is automatically we understand who we are. When we understand who the Supreme Lord is, automatically we understand our position also. Just like we are able to see the sun, we can see ourselves also. If we are not able to see the sun, it is totally pitch dark, then what can we see? We cannot see ourselves also. So our seeing ourselves is dependent on the sun. If we are in the sunlight, we can see the sun, then we can see ourselves also. So, if we are able to understand who is the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and when we understand Krishna to be that Supreme Personality of Godhead, then automatically we understand ourselves also, that I am part and parcel of Krishna, and I am servant, eternally a servant of Krishna. Mamaivancho jivaloke jivavota sanatana. Eternally we are part and parcel of Krishna, and we are eternally his servant. So this understanding of Krishna is actually what liberates us from the entanglement of the gross and subtle bodies. Of course, there is another way to realize that I am not this subtle or gross body. So as it is described here, whenever a person experiences by self-realization that both the gross and subtle bodies have nothing to do with the pure self, at that time he sees himself as well as the Lord. So when we undertake the path of jnana, there is another way, by the process of negating, I am not this, I am not that, I am not the hand, I am not the leg, I am not the eye, I am not the ear, I am not any of those things. Then what am I? I am different from all of these things. So by the process of jnana also one can understand, one can differentiate oneself from the gross and subtle bodies. But that kind of identification or removal of our identification of the gross and subtle bodies is not full knowledge or full identification of the true self of who I am and what I am. As it is mentioned here, at that time he sees himself as well as the Lord. Only when we understand Krishna, then we can really understand our true self, who I am, where have I come from, where am I going after death, what is the goal of human form of life. All these things become absolutely clear only when we understand Krishna. On the path of jnana, what happens is, it is a negative process. We understand I am not this, I am not part of this material nature, I am not this gross body, I am not the subtle body. But then positive identification, what am I then? That is lacking. Therefore the Bhagavatam says, Vasudeve Bhagavati Bhakti Yoga Prajojitaha Janayatyashu Vairagyam Jnanam Cha Yadahaitukam. Instead of going through the process of jnana, if one simply engages in devotional service to Krishna or Vasudeva, which begins with hearing and chanting Krishna's holy name, qualities and pastimes, then what happens is jnanam vairagyam cha yadahaitukam. The knowledge of who I am, what is the goal of life, all these things become revealed automatically to the person. And when that knowledge gets revealed within the heart, automatically another concomitant thing arises within the heart, which is vairagya, detachment from the desires and feelings of the gross and subtle bodies. One is no longer driven by those gross and subtle desires arising out of our body. Those desires may still be there. The desires may still keep coming. They may keep popping up. But the devotee has lost the inclination to satisfy those desires. So whenever a desire for sense gratification arises in the mind of a devotee, he understands this is something which is arising out of my gross and subtle bodies. I am not interested in this because it will take me away from Krishna. So I have to fulfill my vow to my spiritual master and to Krishna, so I will not engage in this sense gratificatory activity. Apuryamanam achara pratishtam samudramapah praveshanti yadvat, Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita. Just like many rivers are coming and entering into the ocean. All rivers generally flow towards the ocean, and finally all the waters of the different various rivers enter into the waters of the ocean. So constantly all through the year, the river waters are going and merging into the water of the ocean. Sometimes the water is less during summer season, during winter season, the amount of water may be very less. The river may be flowing like a stream. During rainy season, the amount of water becomes huge. The river swells up due to the rains, and there is a huge quantity of water which gushes through the rivers and comes into the ocean. Now, although the river, when you look at it during summer season, we can see the amount of water is very less. and the water is flowing peacefully. The same river during rainy season, nobody will go to take bath in the river. Why? Because the flow of the river is very intense and you can see that the whole water is agitated. And sometimes you can see white foam forming on the water because it is flowing with such great velocity. Now, no matter what the situation, whether the rivers are all in spate and coming into the ocean, or the rivers have all dried up and small trickles of water are flowing into the ocean remains the same. No matter how agitated the river may become, the ocean never gets agitated. So, samudram apaha pravisanti yadvat. Samudram in the ocean, apaha, the waters of the river, and even though the quantity of the water coming into the ocean may increase or decrease depending on the season, the ocean is always calm and peaceful. Similarly, a yogi or a devotee, he, although the desires may keep popping up, he has lost the inclination to fulfill those desires. Or if some desire is not fulfilled, some desire of the body or the mind arises, you try to fulfill, but it doesn't happen. The devotee is not agitated. Okay, my karma did not allow me, he lets it go. So, only when one engages in devotional service to Krishna, one can become completely free from the effects of the gross and subtle body. And when one becomes free from the gross and subtle bodies, one can become free from the gross and subtle bodies when one understands Krishna, the Supreme Lord, and when one understands Krishna, one understands one's position also in relationship with Krishna. So therefore, the Bhagavatam begins with the description of all the different incarnations of the Lord, and then finally, like we saw in the previous verses, that Krishnastu Bhagavan Swayam, Krishna is the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So, in the Bhagavad Gita, what Krishna did was, Krishna began by telling Arjuna, you are not the body. Isn't it? Krishna begins with that. Dehinosmin yatha dehe, and Sirinani Jirnani Vihaya, and all those kind of examples Krishna gives. The whole second chapter, where Krishna begins the teachings to Arjuna, is full of jnana. That you are not the body, you are not this, your consciousness, this, that, and all those kind of things. Whereas the Bhagavatam is taking a different approach. Bhagavatam doesn't begin with telling you that you are not the body. Bhagavatam begins with telling who is the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And the entire Bhagavatam is focused around who is the Supreme Personality of Godhead, who his incarnations are, what are the activities of those incarnations, and what are the activities of various devotees in relationship with those incarnations. And simply by studying all this, one can understand who I am and what is the goal of my life. This is the beauty of the Bhagavatam. So, to become free from the clutches of the gross and subtle bodies, to become free from the disease of sense gratification, one does not have to undergo the rigid and very rigorous process of jnana and ashtanga yoga. One simply has to engage in hearing the pastimes, activities and qualities of Krishna, and by understanding his position, automatically the Son of Krishna will reveal who we actually are. So we do not depend on our own intelligence and ability to be able to understand who we are, what we are, and where we have to go. We simply understand Krishna, Krishna does the rest. He reveals in our heart the truth, the reality. So this is the wonderful process of devotional service. And if we engage in devotional service to Krishna, that itself will give us knowledge and renunciation and freedom from the influence of the gross and subtle bodies. So I will stop here. If there are any questions or comments. Anybody? Yes, please.
So it says that you see yourself as well as the Lord.
Yes.
So is that simultaneous? Does it happen at the same time? Or?
Yes. Does seeing the Lord and seeing oneself happen simultaneously? What happens when you walk out into let us say you are within a very dark room, pitch dark, you are not able to see anything. You cannot even see your hands, fingers, nothing you can see. So what you do? you open the door of the room and walk out into the sunlight. The moment you walk out into the sunlight, you can see the sun also, you can see yourself also. Isn't it? It is simultaneous. Because we are part and parcel of Krishna. When we understand Krishna, we understand ourselves also. Yasmin vijnate sarvam evam vijnatam bhavati. If we know Krishna, then everything else becomes known. We don't have to separately endeavor to know something else. I don't have to separately endeavor to know who I am, what is my constitutional position. I don't have to do that. Simply by understanding Krishna, that knowledge of Krishna includes the knowledge of myself. So, when we understand Krishna, simultaneously my position is also revealed. That is how we are doing. Any other question? Yes, please. You can use the mic, please.
Hare Krishna. So you said that when the sunlight is there, then automatically we are able to see the sun also and everything around.
Yes.
So Mayavadis, they identify themselves as God. So they think that they are God. So now they are not able to see the sunlight, but they also feel that they also say that they are soul. They are not this body. So is it like they are acting in the platform of false ego and they are actually not really seeing the self in that sense?
So what happens is, when a Mayavadi says that he is the Supreme Lord, what is happening is, he is under the clutches of the subtle body which desires sense gratification and to become the supreme controller. We have all come into this material world because of the desire to lord it over material nature. We want to become the Supreme Lord. We want to take the position of Krishna. When we were in the spiritual world, we developed envy towards Krishna. That why everybody has to serve Krishna? Why not the people serve me also? So then we come into this material world with this mentality of being the controller and being the lord of everything as well. Now that illusion, that desire to lord it over material nature is invested in the subtle body. So what the subtle body does is, it is constantly impelling you to engage in sense gratificatory activities. Why? By that you can experience that you are the supreme controller and you are the lord of everything you are serving. So the act of sense gratification itself involves exploitation of material nature. That is the way it is designed in this material world. So this subtle body and the gross body is designed to continue to impel us to take the position of Krishna by trying to become the controller and enjoy in this material world. Why? Because that's the purpose for which we have come here, to become the enjoyer and the controller. So Krishna has designed this material world in such a way, he is giving us a gross and subtle body which will help me to try to fulfill that desire. Okay, so in the case of Mayavadis, what happens is that desire is taken to its pinnacle. The ultimate this one, that I myself am the Supreme Lord. So the Mayavadis are not free from the influence of their subtle body, the influence of false ego to become the controller and the supreme. Therefore, only when one engages in devotional service to Krishna is it possible to truly become free from the clutches of the gross and subtle bodies completely. The Mayavadis, the great jnanis, may become free from the influence of the gross body to a very large extent by being able to control the senses and all those kind of stuff. But still, they are very much under the control of, they may even control their mind and intelligence, but they are totally under the control of their false ego, thinking that I am the supreme absolute truth. So, if one has to become completely free from the clutches of the subtle and gross bodies, that is possible only when one becomes devotee of Krishna. Gopi Bharto Padakamayor Dasa Dasanu Dasa. We have to become the servant of the servant of the servant of the servant of the master of the gopis. The more we become servant of the servant, the more we become liberated from the clutches of the gross and subtle bodies. Is that okay? Any other point?
Hare Krishna, Prabhu.
Hare Krishna.
So, Prabhu, you mentioned that Mayavadis still will be influenced by subtle body. But when they get liberated, Doesn't the liberation mean that they are liberated from the subtle body as well?
Their liberation, what happens is, as it is stated in the Srimad Bhagavatam, that what is that verse? Ye anye aravindaksha vimukta maninas vayasta bhavad avisuddha buddhaya. Those who are avisuddha buddhaya, those whose intelligence is not fully purified, that means it is still contaminated with the desires for lording it over material nature. So, avisuddha buddhaya. So, those whose intelligence is still contaminated, they Aravindaksha vimukta maninaha. They are thinking, I have become liberated. Vimukta maninaha. They think I have become liberated. Aruhya kritsrena parampadam. With great difficulty, by following the process of jnana and identifying oneself with the Supreme Brahman, one may reach almost to the topmost position. One may almost reach that position which is just one step away from actual liberation. Even that is a very great achievement. So, but then what happens is, Aruhya kritsrena parampadam tatapatantyadaha anadruta yushmat angrayaha. Anadruta yushmat angrayaha. Because they have not taken shelter of the lotus feet of Krishna, tatapatantyadaha. They again fall down into this material world to engage in sense gratificatory activities. So, if they become totally liberated from their subtle body, there is no question of coming back to this material world. The word avisuddha buddhaya indicates that their intelligence is not fully purified. So, one's intelligence, when it is fully purified, it is free of the influence of the three modes of material nature. Then what happens? One engages in devotional service to Krishna. As Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, Yad gatva na nivartante tadhama paramam mama. One goes there, there is no more coming back to this material world. So the very fact that the Mayavadis will again come back to this material world because of their unpurified intelligence means they have still not become liberated from the influence of their subtle body. That is how we have to understand. Is that okay? So we will stop here. Grantharaj Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai. Shri Shri Radha Gopinath ki jai. Shri Shri Gopinath ki jai. Jagat Guru Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Nitai Gaur Premanand.